Good evening, and thank you for tuning in to the CAN TV show, Cook County Bar Association's CAN TV Live on CAN TV. My name is Mika Thompson, and I will be your host. And today our guest will be Attorney Lewis Powell III, who will be speaking to us about fair housing laws. If you have any questions about this topic, please feel free to dial the number that appears at the bottom of your screen, 312-738-1060. This is a live talk show, and Attorney Powell would welcome any questions that you have about the fair housing law. Please note that you can also watch this show live on www.cantv.org/live. As you may or may not know, the Cook County Bar Association is the largest association of lawyers, African American lawyers and judges in the country. And we take this time every Wednesday at 6 p.m. to give you information about legal issues that are facing the Chicago metropolitan area and the United States at large. Although I'm an attorney and Attorney Powell is an attorney, we do not represent your interests. We suggest that if you have any specific questions that are specific to you, you please contact the Cook County Bar Association and ask to speak with one of the attorneys that are listed on their lawyer referral list. You can call the Cook County Bar Association, or you can go on the web at the cookcountybarassociation.org and click on the lawyer referral link. Okay, now we're going to get started with the topic today. Today we have a very distinguished attorney, Attorney Lewis Powell. Please, Attorney Powell, will you introduce yourself to our audience?
First of all, I don't know about the distinguished part, but we're going to try to do our best to bring some information that you can use, some historical aspects of fair housing, politics, so forth and so on. Very glad to be here. I've been involved in fair housing actually since 1994 in terms of being an instructor, adjunct professor at the John Marshall Law School. Prior to that, I worked for the Harold Washington administration, and as well as my fraternity brother Eugene Sawyer for the city of Chicago. And prior to that, I worked for the Village of Robbins in the community development department. But again, very glad to be here and just look forward to just having a dialogue with you to explain some things.
Okay, so Attorney Powell has the experience and the education and background to provide anyone who's listening in information regarding the fair housing laws in the Chicagoland area as they are applied in Chicago and its greater United States. So for the audience, could you give us a brief kind of definition of what is the Fair Housing Act?
Okay, I'm going to give you the Reader Digest version. Fair housing is for everybody.
Okay.
It's for African Americans, Hispanic, Asian, older people. You cannot discriminate. Fair housing basically protects your right to not be discriminated against on the basis of religion, race, ethnic group, being disabled, your family composition. Family composition, be example, is just a male, female, and children. That's your family composition. So it's basically based on fairness, not allowing you to be discriminated for anything.
Okay, what about sexual orientation? Did they include
sexual orientation? I give you an example. A part of fair housing is the protection of gender. Okay, you cannot be discriminated on the basis of your gender. And we do know that a lot of instances where sometimes landlords will try to take advantage of a woman and try to do things inappropriate to try to gain favor with them. That is illegal. You can definitely get sued for that.
Okay, well, what about houses that are strictly for sorority members or fraternity members?
That's what we call in the business a fine line distinction.
Okay.
Now, you can have, to a certain extent, you can have housing set aside for particular groups. I'll briefly give you some examples. Senior housing. You can have housing set aside for people that are 55 years or older. Mm-hmm. You can have housing set aside for people that are 62 years old and older. Also, you can have a housing set aside for members of your congregation. Okay. A lot of African American churches come to mind, like Antioch under Reverend Daniels, who's gone home to be with the Lord. But Reverend Daniels was a pioneer in terms of having the church and a 501c3 separate organization and use the 501c Development Corporation to build housing, affordable housing for the Inglewood area. Also, churches have not only gotten involved in terms of building affordable housing in their area, but also providing housing for their congregation.
Okay.
So, the distinction is that you can have housing set aside for members of your congregation. Also, in terms of fraternity sorority, you can have housing to a certain extent set aside for members of your fraternity or sorority.
Okay. All right. So those are exceptions.
Those are exceptions
to the law. Okay. So what type of ownership rights are regulated by the Fair Housing Law? And for the audience, I'm speaking of, do you have to be a renter versus a homeowner, or is it housing that is single family versus apartment? What about condos? And then are guests roommates regulated under the Fair Housing
I'm going to give you
Act?
the Reader Digest version. Fair housing fair housing protects you in terms of purchasing property. Fair housing protects you in terms of renting property. I'm going to give you an example. As a realtor has the obligation to present every contract that is presented to him, no matter how ridiculous. It's not up to you as a realtor to determine, well, this price is so low, my client would not possibly take it.
Gotcha.
That's an example. But in terms of fair housing purposes, you as a realtor, you cannot refuse to tender the contract to the seller on a contract that's from a Hispanic or Asian person. I'm just using those as ethnic groups.
Okay.
For example, in terms of renting property, you have to make your property available to everyone. A case in point, if today this is the day that you don't like Asian people, and the Asian person comes up to your apartment and you have it rented, it's on the market, and then you lie like a fool, and you lie and say that the property has been already rented for, vis-a-vis no longer available. That is discrimination in terms of rental. So again, fair housing protects you in terms of purchasing. Fair housing protects you in terms of renting.
Okay. Okay. And so what about the individual that is coming with a Section 8 voucher?
And that's a very good question. When we give lectures, when we teach at school, especially when we give lectures to prospective apartment owners, so forth and so on, ladies and gentlemen, you cannot say no to Section 8. Okay, you cannot. And when I say no to Section 8, you cannot say no on the basis that the person has Section 8. Section 8 is a generic term. Section 8 could be housing choice vouchers, equal opportunity areas. Those all of different variations of Section 8.
But it's some type of subsidy.
Some type of subsidy. Now, this is the case in point. Section 8 by law in Cook County and the state of Illinois. Actually, Chicago was actually ahead of Cook County in terms of making Section 8 discrimination illegal. Cook County came under the leadership of Tony Prepwinkle. They came in after the city of Chicago. And then technically, the professor that argued that case was actually one of my students, Damien Ortiz.
Oh,
okay. He argued that case successful, and he went on appeal that Section 8 is considered a source of income. The distinction for our audience is that source of income is anything that can be factored in, because all landlords should have some type of evaluation as to whether or not the person can afford your apartment.
Right.
Otherwise, you'll be wasting your time. What are we talking about? Section 8, as well as food stamps, alimony, unemployment compensation, all of those should be factored into the person's gross. Now, practically speaking, sometimes unemployment compensation may be a problem because you're not quite sure how long it may last.
That's true.
Okay, but all these are examples of source of income. Again, ladies and gentlemen, you cannot say no to someone just because they have a Section 8. And also, ladies and gentlemen, there's no such thing as a Section 8 compliant building. Each unit stands on its own.
Okay.
Each unit is expected on its own. Now, they very well may say that maybe the outside appearance or maybe the sidewalk may be cracked and you may fall inspection on that. But for all practical purposes, each unit stands alone. So you as the landlord cannot say to the prospective Section 8 person, I can't rent to you because my building is not Section 8 compliant.
Okay.
No such thing. The name of the game is that whoever comes to you 1st between the non-Section 8 and the Section 8 person in terms of well, you don't want to accept checks, but whoever comes to you with certified funds or money, or now you can accept checks, but that's on you, up to you. But most people don't.
Right.
But you're supposed to evaluate them on equal terms, meaning that you just can't say no to the Section 8 person because you believe that your property is not Section 8 compliant. You have to allow them to apply for it.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Okay, so, but what if the amount of money that the voucher is covering versus the amount, because Section 8 is always a
Right.
two-party process. The amount of money that the voucher is covering, and then the amount of money that the person is covering, the amount that the voucher isn't as high as the person, and the person's credit is kind of shaky. Can you then say,
You can evaluate them. And again, ladies and gentlemen, whatever criteria you have in terms of evaluating prospective tenants, that evaluation process has to be the same for everybody.
okay.
I'll give you an example. Some people, before they rent to you, may want to take a visit to where you live now to see how your housekeeping is. If you do that for the Section 8 tenant, you have to do that for the non-Section 8 tenant. If you do a background check, and most people are doing background checks, you have to do it for both the Section 8 and the non-Section 8. If you get caught just doing it for the Section 8 person
There you go. Okay.
and not doing it for the non-Section 8 person, that's a violation, and you can be sued for that.
Okay.
So, ladies and gentlemen, key concepts. You cannot say no on the basis of Section 8. Now, you can say no for other legitimate reasons, but you cannot say no on the basis of Section 8. No such thing as a Section 8 compliant property. Each unit stands on its own.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, if you're just tuning in, please contact us at 312-738-1060 for any questions that you would have for our guest. Our guest is Attorney Lewis Powell III, and he is speaking to us today about the fair housing laws. So come and call in if you have any questions regarding the fair housing laws, and ask a question to our distinguished attorney, Attorney Powell. Okay, Attorney Powell. So we figured out what the definition or idea of what is fair housing laws and what type of ownership rights are regulated. How did the civil rights movement influence the fair housing legislation that we have today?
You know what? That is probably one of my favorite topics. To me, now this is my opinion, fair housing is a subset of the civil rights movement. I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version, okay? The Reader's Digest version is this, and this is my opinion, okay? No offense to Brown versus Board of Education, but to me, separate but equal. But to me, the civil rights movement really ignited when Emmett Till was killed. Okay, when Emmett Till was killed, that shocked the world. When Mama Till made the critical decision of having that open casket showing to the world the brutality of that young man, what happened to that young man. When I was in school, grammar school in the 60s, my teacher was talking about Emmett Till as if it just happened. And reality is, since I was in grammar school very early, like 63 in that time frame, my recollection is Emmett Till got killed, I think, in 1955.
Right.
Now, this is my point. My point is that, in my opinion, that ignited the civil rights movement because the whole world saw the ruthless racial injustice at its almost its highest level. Okay? Emmett Till was killed roughly in 1955. He was funeralized in Roberts Temple. Roberts Temple is still a church that is still up. You go by on State Street. I think the address is like 35, 36, 37 South State, and you see a simple, dignified plaque outside of the church saying this is where Emmett Till was funeralized.
Wow.
A historical place. Now, moving quickly. Emmett Till, that was like the tipping point. You go into the 60s, you had people like H. Rap Brown, who was famous to say, America, you don't turn around, We're going to burn you down. I'm not going to finish the rest. Okay, I'm not going to finish the rest.
It's a family show.
Family show. You had people like Stokely Carmichael. You had people like Huey Newton, Bobby Seale. You had revolutionaries that were not afraid to say, picking up the mantra of Malcolm X, any means necessary. You had a tension. The tension was my fraternity brother, Dr. King, nonviolence, so forth and so on. You had a tension in the progressive movement in terms of which way we're going to go, nonviolent or any means necessary. Dr. King came to the city of Chicago in the early 60s and had a terrible time. Dr. King's lieutenants or staff people really did not want to come to Chicago. Dr. King felt that if he can come to Chicago and crack segregation, he could crack the whole United States. Well, unfortunately, Dr. King had a hard time here. Now, Dr. King accomplished a lot, drew attention to absentee landlordism.
Yes, he
on
did.
The west side of Chicago,
very much did.
Where he and his lovely wife, Coretta King, stayed briefly. It's now a museum on the west side of Chicago. So he drew attention to a lot of good things.
Right.
Now, Dr. King gave his life because the direction he was going got him in trouble. He started speaking not only on civil rights, but we call in the business civil rights. What we're talking about, economic development,
Yes.
economic empowerment.
And fairness in poverty laws.
Right. A lot of people forget Dr. King was in Memphis, not on a really civil rights demonstration. He was there to support the sanitary workers
Yes.
in Memphis because of the unsanitary conditions and the meager wages that they were getting. When Dr. King was killed, I'm old enough to remember, this nation went up. There are parts of the west side that have been burnt down and still not been brought up. So what am I saying? When Dr. King was killed, this man of peace, that just ignited this nation. And the powers to be, I was taught by my professor, Mr. F. Willis Crusoe, who's litigated more fair housing cases than anybody, that the powers that be said that we had to do something because this nation was in the flame, going up.
And
okay?
there's a lot of anger. Lot of anger.
This is a very, very critical point. We all know how long and how hard it is to pass legislation.
Yes.
You can bottle up stuff forever if you know what you're doing.
Yes.
Dr. King was killed in 1968, I believe April 3rd. I may be off on that, but the Fair Housing Act was passed within 7 days.
Wow.
Okay, of his death. That's quick.
And if that is a very comprehensive act,
and
right?
the Fair Housing Act, I'm going to read Reader's Digest version. Race, ethnic, disability, well, not disability came in 1989, but basically race, religion, national origin, so forth and so on. I may be missing a category or two, but in essence, the Fair Housing Act came about as a direct result. Now, it was, hopefully, it would have been coming, but the fact of the matter is, it was accelerated in terms of the passage because of the death of Martin Luther King. So, Reader's Digest version, the civil rights movement had a direct impact. In fact, it was the driving force, in my opinion, of fair housing.
Okay. And who was the fair housing law written to protect? In light of the fact that you're talking about the civil rights movement, was it just for the minorities, or was it for all of the other people that you were talking about in that
Everybody. Now we have to be honest. Clearly, you look at the legislative comments. Clearly, they had primarily in mind African Americans to a certain extent because they had the badge that we call the incidence of slavery.
Right.
And what incidence of slavery? Your color, skin, inability to get a job, inability to get housing, so forth and so on. But fair housing is for everyone. It's for the African American. It's for the Hispanic brother. It's for the Asian brother. It's for the little Russian person, immigrant coming in. Fair housing covers a whole wide area of protected classes. Protected classes are basically saying if you fall within this protected class, you have protection under the Fair Housing Act. Now again, yes, they probably had African Americans primarily in mind when they passed it, but the overall aspect of it is for everyone, not just African Americans.
And a lot of people don't realize that prior to the passage of the Fair Housing Act, the newspaper would advertise housing. They'd have a column just for housing for African Americans, right? And then a column for white Americans, and then they'd have columns for women because there were housing just for women only.
Absolutely.
Correct? So that after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, those columns had to disappear. It was discriminatory in a violation of the law to advertise in the newspaper, any public news source on the TV or the radio, housing simply for particular classes of people as they had done before. But you can always go to your library and pull up old versions of the newspaper prior to the passage, and
Right.
you will see.
My grandmother saved a lot of stuff by newspapers. I'm not quite sure. I think we kept some of them where they had different, descriptions of racial discrimination, so forth and so on. Also, you had what you call covenants. Covenants would be in the title saying that you could not sell the property to a person of color or Jewish, so forth and so on. And those covenants by law now are invalid.
Right.
A lot of times, if you're really looking at a title abstract where it shows the history of the property, every so often you'll see a racial covenant in there. But the title company just ignores it
Right.
because, again, by law, they're null and void.
They're null and void. And those covenants were actually agreements that were drafted by attorneys or non-attorneys between communities, right? Members of the community that wanted to make sure that their area remained a certain
Absolutely.
ethnic group or race. Okay. So we're going to just do one more question and then we may be out of time. Does the law also address the manner in which homes are sold, especially, like I said, with condominiums? Because individual condo unit owners can rent out their condos
Absolutely.
and stuff. But there's also that other layer of regulation with the association. So can you...
We need a half an hour for that, but this is really digest version.
Okay.
Condo associations have a history of being mean.
Okay.
They cannot discriminate. They cannot, pick out a particular group saying they don't want. Now, they can do credit checks to a certain extent.
Okay.
They can monitor and limit the amount of units that are rented.
Okay.
And the reason is for refinancing purposes of the condo association,
Okay.
because a lot of lenders do not like to see a condo association or a condo development that has more renters than owners.
Okay.
Okay, so they do have a right to a certain extent to restrict the amount, the number of units that are rented. However, that does not give them the right to discriminate on an individual basis on the basis of race, religion, color, so forth and so on, and the other protected class in terms of allowing somebody to buy a condo or to allow somebody to rent a condo.
Okay.
And a lot of condo associations have been sued left and right for discriminatory practices, especially in the area of disability.
Oh, yes, yes. And that can be a little expensive for some of these condo
It can
associations to
be.
accommodate.
That's an area of the law that is very complex. Reasonable modification, Reader's Digest version. Under certain circumstances, you as the tenant can make a request for a reasonable modification, which is a physical change, maybe something like grab bars, but you have to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you're living in a building that's fully subsidized, like 504 housing, the whole building is subsidized, then if the reasonable modification is granted, the landlord has to pay for it.
Wow.
But a lot of times, 9 times out of 10, it's you as the tenant has to pay for it.
Got you.
And you may have to restore it back to its original condition.
Once you leave.
Once you leave.
the property. Okay. So those are some other things that the fair housing law addresses when you're talking about home sales versus home renters and condominium associations too. What about the hotel situation? Are they regulated?
They're regulated to a certain extent. Very quickly, Reader's Digest version.
Okay.
You cannot discriminate in terms of obviously people that are applying, they're trying to rent temporary, because hotels are temporary. But to a certain extent, they are regulated by the fair housing laws.
Okay. Well, we'd like to thank Attorney Powell for answering our questions today on fair housing. We've learned a lot today. We'd like all of the audience members to tune in next week at 6 p.m. where we'll have another attorney guest who will address another interesting issue, area of law and answer any of your questions. Again, this is the Cook County Bar Association's Live on Can TV show. I am your host, Attorney Mika Thompson, and this is our guest, Attorney Lewis Powell. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.